Okay, so today we are diving into something really unique, a super cryptic document called the Ledger of Sabotage. Honestly, it reads like a personal diary, a police report, and an ancient myth all kind of rolled into one. So let's try and decode its strange structure together and figure out what story it's actually trying to tell.
Right off the bat, the document hits you with this line: speak back or be destroyed. I mean, wow, it's so intense, so confrontational, and it immediately makes you ask, what in the world starts with a command like that? This is really our first clue that we're not dealing with your typical story here. So, how are we going to make sense of all this? Well, here's the game plan. First, we'll just look at what the ledger is. Then we'll get into the absolute key that unlocks the whole thing, this idea of the Affidavit versus Mythic Arc. From there, we'll dive into some specific case studies, what the author calls archetypes, and then finally, we'll look at why they even wrote this in the first place.
At its heart, the ledger is a personal record, a log of what the author perceives as acts of hostility. But what makes it so fascinating is how it organizes everything. See, the author doesn't just list out grievances, they categorize them into these things they call archetypes, which are meant to represent these recurring patterns of conflict. All right, now we get to it. This is the absolute key to understanding this entire document. Seriously, once you get this part, everything else just clicks into place. Every single entry is built on this fundamental tension between two ways of seeing the exact same event. This is our decoder ring for the whole text.
So here's how it works. On one side, you have the affidavit. You should think of this like a really dry, factual police report. Just the dates, locations, specific details. But then, on the other side, you have the Mythic Arc. This takes that same event and recasts it in this epic, symbolic language. Understanding this split, this duality, is pretty much how we're going to navigate the rest of the ledger.
So let's put that decoder ring to use, right? We're going to start by looking at what the author calls the physical archetypes. These are the ones that represent direct, person-to-person confrontations.
Our first case study is an archetype the author calls the sprinting shade. I mean, the name itself is pretty evocative, isn't it? But to really get it, you have to look at the two sides of its story, the affidavit and then the myth.
Okay, first up, the affidavit side. The author lays out what they present as the hard facts of an incident in Kauai. And notice how specific these details are. An aggressor sprinting at them, using racial slurs, and weaponizing these totally everyday objects, a BMX bike, a skateboard, an Allen wrench. The account goes on to include a partner destroying belongings, a dog attack, and, this is crucial, a claim that the police distorted their testimony.
And now, just watch this transformation. In the Mythic Arc, those mundane objects, they get elevated into these epic symbols. The BMX bike becomes a spear, the skateboard is a shield, and the Allen wrench is now a jagged glove. The aggressor isn't just some person anymore, they're reframed as this mythic figure, the sprinting shade.
And believe me, this isn't a one-off thing. The author uses this exact same affidavit versus myth framework over and over again for other archetypes of direct hostility. Let's just look at a couple more real quick.
You can see the pattern so clearly right here. For an archetype called the saboteur of signal, the factual claim of equipment was tampered with turns into the mythic phrase severed lines, seeking silence. And in the racial shade, the use of racial slurs gets reframed as language turned blade. It's a really clear and consistent method of translating the literal into the symbolic.
So this whole framework isn't just for individual fights. The author also applies it on a much bigger scale to describe what they see as institutional or, systemic hostility.
And this brings us to a really key systemic archetype the author calls the Bureaucratic Inverter. Now, just like the name suggests, this isn't about a single person. It's about a process, a mechanism inside institutions that, according to the author, actually inverts reality itself.
So how does this inversion thing supposedly work? Well, according to the ledger, it starts with testimony is given. But then, official statements start to reframe the whole narrative, and eventually, they invert the blame right back onto the original victim. The author then presents this ledger as the final step in the process, a personal record designed to correct that official inversion. And of course, here's the Mythic Arc for that whole process. The author describes it as rotating truth until victims wore blame. It's such a powerful, poetic image for what's otherwise described as this really frustrating and repetitive institutional pattern. So all of this leads us to the big question, right? Why? Why would somebody create such an elaborate, stylized document? Well, for the answer, we can actually turn to the author's own disclaimer, which lays out the whole purpose behind this project.
The author actually has a specific name for this kind of work, a mythic infrastructure. It's a pretty fascinating term. They're very clear that this isn't meant to be some political platform or a literal historical record. No. Instead, they see it as a diagnostic tool, a framework designed to identify and expose what they see as these recurring patterns of hostility. It's their way of taking chaotic, painful events and giving them a larger, more understandable structure.
And if we drill down a little deeper, the author states 3 main goals. They call the work a cinematic indictment and a sovereign broadcast. That's language that really suggests they're making a public declaration, but doing it completely on their own terms. And the whole point of this declaration? To expose what they call ritualized containment and systemic erosion. So in the end, we're left with this document that's working on 2 different levels at the same time, the factual and the mythological. It's a personal record that's been transformed into this symbolic epic. And that leaves us with one final lingering question to think about. When a personal ledger becomes a myth, what is it really asking us to believe?